Picture this. You're 5, draped in silk, sitting in a palace where one wrong whisper can end a dynasty. The most powerful woman in China is your mother, and your jailer. If every smile you give is a survival tactic, what happens the day you stop smiling? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The year is 684 AD, and the Tang Dynasty palace in Luoyang buzzes with attention so thick you could cut it with a ceremonial sword. Empress Wu has done the unthinkable. She has deposed her own son, Emperor Zhongzong, after he ruled for barely 2 months, sending him into exile for the crime of suggesting that his father-in-law might deserve a government position. In the twisted logic of imperial politics, showing loyalty to anyone other than his mother was tantamount to treason. Now she faces a choice that will define not just her reign, but the fate of her remaining children. Wu Zetian stands in her private chambers, still wearing the heavy court robes that mark her as regent, though everyone knows she wields the true power of an emperor. The irony isn't lost on her. For centuries, Chinese women have been taught that their highest virtue lies in obedience to fathers, then husbands, then sons. Yet here she stands, having systematically eliminated or controlled every man who might challenge her authority, including her own offspring. The dragon robes she wears were never meant for a woman's body, but she has made them fit through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and a willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone for power. Her advisors cluster around maps and scrolls, their voices low as they discuss the precarious political situation. The deposed Zhongzong has supporters throughout the empire, nobles who see Wu's unprecedented female rule as an affront to the natural order. Rebellions simmer in distant provinces, led by Tang loyalists who refuse to accept a woman's authority. The military remains divided, with some generals pledging loyalty to Wu while others quietly position themselves for whatever comes next. In this atmosphere of barely contained chaos, every decision carries the weight of potential civil war. But Wu's most pressing concern isn't the rebellious provinces or the wavering generals. It's her remaining son, Li Dan, who at 5 years old represents both her succession plan and her greatest threat. The boy possesses imperial blood that could legitimize any rival's claim to power. In the wrong hands, he could become the figurehead for a restoration that would see Wu herself executed as a usurper. Yet he's also her only path to ensuring that her revolutionary changes to Chinese governance might survive her death. The palace servants who tend to young Li Dan move through their duties with the careful precision of people who understand that a single misstep could mean death. They dress him in the finest silks, feed him delicacies from across the empire, and educate him in classical poetry and philosophy. But they also watch him constantly, reporting every word he speaks, every gesture he makes, every person he shows affection toward. The child exists in a gilded cage where love is dangerous and trust is fatal. Li Dan's daily routine reflects the impossible balance his mother must maintain. In the mornings, he receives instruction in the Confucian classics, learning about filial piety and proper relationships between rulers and subjects. The irony is palpable as his tutors, all male scholars who privately question Wu's right to rule, teach him about the natural hierarchy that his mother has shattered through her very existence. They speak of the mandate of heaven and the importance of legitimate succession, while carefully avoiding any mention of how that legitimacy might apply to his own future. After his lessons, Li Dan practices calligraphy under the watchful eye of court officials, who analyze each brushstroke for signs of political inclination. Does he write certain characters with particular emphasis? Does his style suggest independence of thought that might later manifest as rebellion? Even a child's handwriting becomes a matter of state security when that child could someday challenge the most powerful woman in Chinese history. The afternoons bring martial training, though Li Dan's instructors walk a delicate line between preparing him for potential leadership and ensuring he doesn't become too confident in his own abilities. He learns archery and swordplay, but always with weapons that have been carefully examined for defects, always under supervision that prevents him from forming close relationships with military instructors who might later become allies in any future power struggle. Every aspect of his education is designed to create a competent but controllable heir. Meanwhile, Wu Zetian navigates the treacherous waters of Tang Dynasty court politics with a skill that both amazes and terrifies her contemporaries. She has survived in a system designed to destroy ambitious women by being more ruthless than the men around her, more clever in her alliances, and more willing to sacrifice personal relationships for political necessity. Her rise to power left a trail of bodies that includes not just political enemies, but members of her own family who posed threats to her ambitions. The Empress Dowager who once stood in her way died under mysterious circumstances, as did Wu's own daughter, whose death provided the pretext for eliminating Wu's rival concubine. Court records from this period, written in the careful coded language that Chinese historians used when describing dangerous truths, hint at a pattern of convenient deaths that cleared Wu's path to absolute power. Modern historians debate the extent of her direct involvement in these fatalities, but the pattern is unmistakable. Those who threatened Wu Zetian's position had a tendency to meet unfortunate ends. Now, with her son Li Dan as both heir and potential threat, Wu faces perhaps her greatest challenge yet. Traditional Chinese political theory offers no precedent for her situation. Previous regent mothers ruled only until their sons came of age, then stepped aside to allow male succession to continue. But Wu has no intention of stepping aside, and she certainly can't allow Li Dan to mature into an independent political actor who might challenge her authority. The solution she develops is as brilliant as it is cruel. Li Dan will remain nominally the heir, providing her rule with the legitimacy that comes from protecting imperial succession. But he will never be allowed to develop the relationships, knowledge, or personal authority that would make him a genuine threat. He will be kept perpetually childlike, dependent on his mother's guidance for every decision, surrounded by advisors who report directly to Wu herself. This strategy requires careful management of Li Dan's education and social development. His tutors receive detailed instructions about which aspects of imperial history to emphasize and which to avoid. He learns about dutiful sons who served their parents faithfully, but not about ambitious princes who seized power through military coups. He studies poetry that celebrates family harmony and loyalty, while potentially subversive texts that discuss the mandate of heaven and legitimate rebellion are kept far from his reach. The young prince's personal relationships are even more carefully controlled. Potential friends are vetted by Wu's secret police, and anyone who shows too much interest in the boy's political education is quietly transferred to distant postings. Even his wet nurses and personal servants are rotated regularly to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might later be exploited by political enemies. Li Dan grows up surrounded by people, yet profoundly isolated from any relationship that isn't mediated by his mother's political needs. Wu's control extends to Li Dan's physical environment as well. The sections of the palace where he lives are carefully designed to limit his understanding of the broader political situation. Windows are positioned to prevent him from seeing military exercises or official processions that might give him ideas about his own potential power. The books in his personal library are selected to reinforce messages of filial obedience and the wisdom of accepting guidance from elder relatives, particularly mothers. Yet even as Wu implements these controls, she faces a fundamental contradiction that threatens to undermine her entire strategy. The very qualities that make Li Dan controllable as a child, his innocence, his dependence, his lack of political sophistication, are the same qualities that will make him unsuitable as a future ruler. If he remains too childlike, he won't be able to command the respect necessary to maintain imperial authority after Wu's death. But if he develops the skills and confidence needed for effective leadership, he becomes a potential threat to her own position. This contradiction becomes more acute as Li Dan grows older and begins to show signs of natural intelligence and curiosity. At 7, he starts asking questions about why certain relatives no longer visit the palace, why his brother was sent away, Why some of his tutors disappear without explanation. Wu's advisors watch these developments with growing concern, understanding that the boy's maturing mind represents a ticking time bomb in the carefully constructed edifice of his mother's power. The Empress responds to these challenges by intensifying her control over Li Dan's environment, while simultaneously beginning to consider more permanent solutions to the problem he represents. Palace records from this period show increased expenditures on surveillance equipment and personnel assigned to monitor the young prince's activities. At the same time, Wu begins to explore alternative succession arrangements that might allow her to maintain power without relying on Li Dan as her designated heir. The palace gardens where Li Dan plays become a carefully orchestrated theater of deception. Every flower bed, every ornamental pond, every pavilion where he might rest during his supervised walks has been designed to reinforce his mother's narrative about their family's righteousness and the natural order of their rule. The gardeners who tend these spaces are actually Wu's agents, trained to engage the young prince in seemingly innocent conversations that probe his developing political awareness while subtly reinforcing approved messages about loyalty and obedience. As Li Dan reaches his 8th year, the weight of his impossible position begins to manifest in ways that alarm even Wu's most loyal advisors. The boy develops a stutter when speaking to adults outside his immediate household, a nervous habit of picking at his elaborate court robes until the silk frays, and an unsettling tendency to stare at portraits of his exiled brother with an expression that court observers struggle to interpret. Is it longing, confusion, or something more dangerous? The first stirrings of political awareness in a mind that was never supposed to develop such thoughts? Wu's response to these troubling signs reveals the calculating brilliance that has kept her in power for so long. Rather than increasing restrictions on Li Dan's activities, she implements what her advisors privately call the golden leash strategy. The boy is given apparent freedoms, small choices about his daily routine, favorite foods at meals, which books to read during leisure hours. But every option presented to him has been carefully curated by his mother's agents. He chooses from a menu of pre-approved alternatives, creating the illusion of independence while remaining completely under Wu's control. The psychological toll of this manipulation on Li Dan becomes evident to those few palace servants who dare to observe closely. They report a child who laughs too loudly at jokes that aren't funny, who agrees too quickly with any adult opinion expressed in his presence, who seems to have internalized the understanding that his survival depends on being perpetually pleasing to everyone around him. This hyper-vigilant compliance isn't natural childhood behavior. It's the defensive strategy of a young mind that has learned to navigate an environment where authenticity equals danger. Meanwhile, Wu faces mounting pressure from other quarters of her empire. The Buddhist monasteries that once supported her rule begin to whisper about the unnaturalness of a woman holding supreme power for so long. Confucian scholars publish carefully worded treatises about the importance of male succession in maintaining cosmic harmony. Even her own appointed officials start to suggest, with the delicate indirection that characterizes Chinese court discourse, that perhaps it might be time to consider transitioning power to the next generation. These pressures force Wu to confront the timeline of her own mortality and the succession crisis that will inevitably follow her death. At 59, she remains vigorous and sharp, but she cannot rule forever. If Li Dan is to serve as her successor, he must be prepared for leadership while remaining sufficiently dependent on her chosen advisors to ensure continuity of her policies. If he cannot be trusted in that role, then alternative arrangements must be made before opposition forces can rally around his imperial bloodline. The Empress begins implementing what court historians will later call the heir conditioning program, a systematic effort to prepare Li Dan for ceremonial leadership, while ensuring he remains incapable of independent decision-making. He is gradually introduced to more formal court functions, standing beside his mother during certain audiences and official ceremonies. But his participation is carefully scripted, with predetermined responses to any questions he might receive and clear signals from Wu's advisors about when to speak and when to remain silent. Li Dan's first major public appearance as heir apparent takes place during the Autumn Harvest Festival of 692 AD. The 8-year-old prince, dressed in miniature imperial robes that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime, stands on a raised platform beside his mother as she addresses thousands of gathered subjects. The symbolism is carefully orchestrated to reinforce Wu's legitimacy, while displaying her designated successor to potential rivals who might question the stability of her dynasty. But even this moment of apparent triumph contains the seeds of future complications. Palace observers note how Li Dan's eyes dart nervously between his mother and the crowd, seeking approval and guidance for every gesture. When a minor official approaches to pay formal respects, the boy instinctively steps backward, positioning his mother between himself and the potential threat. This defensive behavior, while understandable given his upbringing, signals to experienced courtiers that Wu's heir lacks the confident presence necessary for effective imperial leadership. The festival also provides Wu's enemies with their first clear look at the designated successor in nearly 3 years. What they see both reassures and concerns them. Li Dan's obvious dependence on his mother suggests that even if he does eventually inherit the throne, real power will likely remain with Wu's chosen advisors and established power structures. This continuity might actually serve the interests of officials who have prospered under Wu's rule and fear the disruption that could come with a completely independent new emperor. However, Li Dan's imperial bloodline remains a powerful symbol that could legitimize opposition movements if properly exploited. Several provincial governors who have maintained careful neutrality during Wu's reign begin sending discreet envoys to the capital, ostensibly to pay respects to the heir apparent, but actually to assess his potential as a future alternative to Wu's direct rule. These diplomatic probes represent the opening moves in political games that could eventually determine the fate of the entire dynasty. Wu's intelligence network, the most sophisticated surveillance system in the medieval world, tracks every one of these contacts and evaluates their implications for her long-term security. She understands that Li Dan's growing visibility makes him an increasingly attractive target for her enemies, but she also recognizes that keeping him completely hidden would fuel speculation about his fitness for rule or even his continued existence. The balance between protection and preparation becomes more delicate with each passing month. The Empress addresses this challenge by implementing a strategy of controlled exposure that reveals Li Dan to specific audiences under carefully managed circumstances while maintaining strict limits on his independent interactions with potential political allies or enemies. He attends certain court functions where his presence serves Wu's political needs, but always with predetermined roles that prevent him from developing his own relationships or power base within the imperial bureaucracy. This careful choreography extends to Li Dan's education, which by age 8 has evolved into something resembling modern psychological conditioning, more than traditional imperial tutoring. His teachers, all personally selected by Wu and rotated regularly to prevent emotional attachments, focus heavily on case studies of historical princes who brought disaster upon their families and kingdoms through premature ambition or disloyalty to their parents. The message is reinforced through poetry, philosophical discussions, and even the selection of historical texts used in his classical education. Li Dan learns about the Tang founder's nephew, who rebelled against imperial authority and brought civil war upon the empire, but not about successful princes who established their own legitimate dynasties. He studies the moral lessons of filial piety through texts that emphasize absolute obedience to parental wisdom, while writings that discuss the mandate of heaven and the legitimacy of dynastic change are carefully excluded from his curriculum. His understanding of Chinese history becomes a carefully curated narrative, designed to support his mother's political needs rather than prepare him for independent leadership. The psychological impact of this educational manipulation becomes increasingly evident as Li Dan approaches his 10th birthday. Palace servants report that he has developed an almost compulsive need to seek approval before expressing any opinion, even on trivial matters like preferences for food or clothing. When asked direct questions about his future role as emperor, he invariably deflects to statements about learning from his mother's wisdom and hoping to serve the empire as she directs. While this deference pleases Wu and her advisors, it also raises concerns about whether he will ever develop the personal authorities necessary for effective rule. As autumn deepens into winter, rumors begin circulating through the capital about Wu's health and the timeline for a potential succession. The 60-year-old Empress remains publicly active and sharp, but palace physicians whisper about her increasing reliance on medicinal treatments and her occasional absences from routine court functions. These whispers, whether accurate or deliberately planted by Wu herself to test reactions, create a sense of urgency around the succession question that forces previously neutral parties to begin choosing sides. The winter of 692 AD brings with it more than snow to the imperial capital. It brings whispers that slither through the palace corridors like serpents, carrying poison more deadly than any assassin's blade. Li Dan, now approaching his 9th birthday, begins to notice things a younger child might have missed. The way conversations stop when he enters a room. The nervous glances exchanged between his tutors when they think he's not watching. The sudden appearance of new guards outside his chambers, men whose eyes never seem to rest, whose hands never stray far from their weapons. Wu Zetian sits in her private study, surrounded by intelligence reports that paint an increasingly complex picture of the political landscape. A Buddhist monastery in Sichuan has been discovered harboring texts that question the legitimacy of female rule. 3 provincial governors have failed to send their regular tribute payments on schedule, a delay that might indicate coordination rather than coincidence. Most troubling of all, her network of informants reports growing interest among Tang loyalists in Li Dan's potential as a focal point for restoration movements. The Empress understands that time is becoming her enemy in ways she never anticipated. Each month that passes makes Li Dan older, more visible, and potentially more attractive to those who dream of returning to traditional male succession. Yet each month also makes him more psychologically dependent on the very system of control that ensures his compliance. She has created a perfect puppet, but puppets rarely inspire the kind of loyalty necessary to maintain imperial power in times of crisis. Her solution reveals the cold genius that has sustained her through decades of court intrigue. If Li Dan cannot be both controllable and inspiring, then perhaps he doesn't need to be inspiring at all. Wu begins developing what her closest advisors privately call the Regency solution, a plan that would see Li Dan formally ascend to the throne, while real authority remains permanently vested in a council of regents, handpicked by Wu herself. The young emperor would serve as a ceremonial figurehead, performing the ritual functions that legitimize imperial rule while leaving actual governance to more experienced hands. This strategy requires careful preparation of both Li Dan and the court bureaucracy that would implement it. The boy must be trained to perform imperial ceremonies convincingly while understanding that substantive decisions will always be made by others. Palace officials must be conditioned to accept this division of authority as natural and permanent, rather than a temporary arrangement during the heir's minority. Most challenging of all, potential rivals must be convinced that this system serves their interests better than the alternatives of civil war or foreign intervention. Wu tests her regency concept during the New Year celebrations of 693 AD, where Li Dan performs his most significant public role to date. The 9-year-old prince, coached for weeks on every gesture and phrase, conducts the traditional ceremony of imperial blessing for the coming agricultural season. Thousands of subjects kneel in the palace courtyard as he recites ancient prayers for good harvests and prosperity, his young voice carrying across the silent crowd with surprising authority. Yet those closest to the ceremony notice telling details that suggest the limitations of Wu's grand design. Li Dan's eyes constantly seek his mother's face for reassurance, even during moments when imperial protocol demands his complete focus on the ritual proceedings. When an elderly minister stumbles during the formal presentations, the boy instinctively looks to Wu for guidance on how to respond, rather than handling the minor crisis with the confident grace expected of true imperial authority. More significantly, the audience's reaction to Li Dan reveals the complex political calculations underlying every aspect of court life. Longtime supporters of Wu's rule applaud dutifully but without genuine enthusiasm, understanding that the boy's eventual ascension might diminish their own influence if he proves less amenable to their counsel than his mother. Potential opponents watch carefully for signs of independence or strength that might make Li Dan a viable alternative to Wu's continued dominance, but find only a well-trained child performing a predetermined role. This lukewarm reception crystallizes Wu's growing recognition that her son's psychological conditioning may have been too thorough for her own strategic needs. A completely compliant heir might ensure continuity of her policies, but it also risks creating a power vacuum that ambitious generals or provincial governors might eventually exploit. The Empress begins contemplating modifications to Li Dan's education that might develop more assertiveness while maintaining his fundamental loyalty to her guidance. These modifications take the form of carefully controlled challenges designed to test and strengthen Li Dan's decision-making abilities without exposing him to genuinely independent thought. He is presented with minor administrative problems, disputes between palace servants or questions about household management, that require him to choose between predetermined alternatives. Each decision is followed by detailed discussions with his tutors about the reasoning behind his choice and the potential consequences of different approaches. Li Dan responds to these exercises with the hyper-vigilant compliance that has become his primary survival strategy. He analyzes each situation exhaustively, seeking clues about which choice his mother would prefer, rather than developing his own judgment about optimal outcomes. When his tutors praise him for making wise decisions, he shows no satisfaction in his personal achievement, only relief at having successfully navigated another potential test of his loyalty and obedience. This pattern becomes more pronounced as spring arrives and Wu increases the frequency and complexity of these training scenarios. Li Dan begins displaying physical symptoms of stress that alarm even his carefully selected medical attendants. He develops recurring headaches that seem to correlate with periods of intensive decision-making training. His appetite becomes erratic, and palace servants report finding him awake at odd hours, staring out windows or arranging and rearranging personal belongings with obsessive precision. Wu's reaction to these concerning developments reveals both her genuine maternal instincts and her ruthless political calculations. She temporarily reduces the intensity of Li Dan's training regimen while consulting with physicians about treatments that might alleviate his symptoms without compromising his conditioning. Palace records from this period show payments to doctors specializing in nervous disorders and purchases of exotic medicines, rumored to calm troubled minds while maintaining mental acuity. Yet even as she tends to Li Dan's immediate health concerns, Wu continues planning for scenarios that might require more drastic interventions. Her private correspondence with trusted advisors, preserved in coded documents discovered centuries later, discusses contingency plans for situations where her son's psychological stability might become a liability to imperial security. These plans range from more intensive isolation and medical treatment to options that court historians prefer to describe in euphemistic terms. The summer of 693 AD brings external pressures that force Wu to accelerate her timeline for implementing the regency solution. A coalition of Tang loyalists led by generals who served under previous emperors begins coordinating military exercises near the capital that ostensibly serve training purposes but actually represent thinly veiled demonstrations of strength. Their message is clear. Wu's reign is tolerated only as long as it serves as a bridge to legitimate male succession, and that tolerance has limits. As these military pressures coincide with diplomatic challenges from neighboring kingdoms that have never fully accepted Wu's legitimacy as a ruler. Turkic tribes along the northern borders increase their raiding activities, testing whether a female emperor will respond with the same military decisiveness as her male predecessors. Korean kingdoms that previously sent regular tribute begin delaying their payments and demanding more favorable trade terms, apparently believing that Wu's political position is too precarious to risk military confrontation. Wu responds to these combined threats with characteristic decisiveness, but her solutions create new complications for Li Dan's role in her succession plans. She orders military campaigns against both the Turkic raiders and the Korean kingdoms, demonstrating that female leadership can be just as ruthlessly effective as male rule. However, these military actions require her personal attention and presence at strategic planning sessions that prevent her from maintaining direct oversight of Li Dan's continued conditioning. For the first time in his life, Li Dan experiences periods of reduced surveillance and control. His tutors, lacking Wu's direct guidance, become more relaxed in their enforcement of strict behavioral protocols. Palace servants, distracted by the increased activity surrounding military preparations, pay less attention to monitoring his conversations and activities. Most significantly, Li Dan begins encountering palace officials and visiting dignitaries who haven't been thoroughly briefed on how to interact with the carefully controlled heir apparent. These exposures to less managed social interactions reveal both the success and the limitations of Wu's psychological conditioning program. Li Dan demonstrates remarkable skill at deflecting potentially compromising questions and avoiding commitments that might conflict with his mother's policies. When a visiting governor asked his opinion about military strategy against the northern barbarians, the 9-year-old smoothly redirects the conversation to praise for his mother's wisdom and his own need for continued learning before presuming to offer advice on such important matters. However, these same interactions also expose Li Dan to perspectives and information that Wu has worked for years to keep from him. He overhears casual references to his brother's exile that contradict the official explanation he has been given about Zhongzong's voluntary withdrawal from court life. He observes the genuine fear and respect that military commanders show toward his mother, emotions quite different from the performative deference of his usual companions. Most unsettling of all, he begins to understand that many people see him not as an individual, but as a symbol whose value lies entirely in his potential usefulness to their own political ambitions. This growing awareness creates internal conflicts that Li Dan struggles to resolve within the framework of absolute obedience that has defined his entire existence. He cannot question his mother's explanations without violating the fundamental principle of filial loyalty that governs his conditioning. Yet he cannot ignore the evidence of his own observations without acknowledging that his understanding of reality may be fundamentally flawed. The psychological tension between these incompatible demands begins manifesting in behavioral changes that alarm Wu's agents when they resume closer supervision. Li Dan develops a habit of asking seemingly innocent questions that probe the boundaries of acceptable inquiry without directly challenging established narratives. He wonders aloud why his brother chose to leave the palace when court life seems so pleasant, or why certain military commanders seem so concerned about threats from enemies that his tutors describe as minor nuisances easily handled by imperial forces. These questions, while carefully phrased to avoid direct contradiction of official positions, suggest a developing critical intelligence that could eventually challenge the entire structure of his controlled existence. Wu's return from supervising military preparations brings swift recognition of these concerning developments and immediate implementation of corrective measures. Li Dan's tutors are replaced with individuals who have specific training in managing psychologically complex imperial heirs. His daily schedule is restructured to minimize uncontrolled social interactions, while increasing the time devoted to reinforcing core messages about loyalty, obedience, and the dangers of premature political ambition. Most significantly, Wu herself begins spending more personal time with her son, using their mother-child relationship to reinforce the conditioning that formal education has established. These intensified control measures prove partially effective in suppressing Li Dan's emerging independence, but they cannot completely eliminate the awareness that has already developed. The 9-year-old prince learns to hide his questions and observations rather than abandon them entirely. He becomes skilled at presenting the appearance of complete compliance while privately maintaining a growing catalog of inconsistencies and contradictions in the official version of reality he has been taught to accept. This internal division between public compliance and private awareness creates a new kind of psychological burden that Wu's conditioning program was never designed to address. Li Dan must now manage not only the external pressures of being an imperial heir, but also the internal stress of maintaining elaborate deceptions about his own thoughts and perceptions. The hypervigilant behavior that once served as a simple survival strategy becomes a complex performance that requires constant mental energy to sustain. Palace physicians note increasing incidents of what they describe as nervous exhaustion. Episodes where Li Dan becomes temporarily unable to perform his usual social and educational functions. During these incidents, he retreats into almost catatonic withdrawal, sitting motionless for hours while staring at nothing in particular. When questioned about these episodes, he claims to be thinking about classical poetry or philosophical principles, explanations that his medical attendants find unconvincing but dare not challenge too directly given his imperial status. Wu recognizes these symptoms as indicators of psychological breakdown that could ultimately compromise her entire succession strategy. A heir apparent who cannot function in social situations or fulfill ceremonial duties becomes a political liability rather than an asset. Yet her options for addressing Li Dan's deteriorating mental state are constrained by the same secrecy requirements that created the problem in the first place. Seeking outside medical consultation would require revealing details about his condition that might be exploited by political enemies, while internal palace resources lack the specialized knowledge needed to treat such complex psychological disorders. Her solution involves a calculated risk that demonstrates both her desperation and her continued brilliance in managing impossible political situations. Wu decides to gradually introduce Lai Dan to carefully selected aspects of political reality, allowing him to develop a more accurate understanding of his situation while maintaining strict boundaries around information that could be truly dangerous to her rule. This partial revelation strategy requires exquisite timing and precise control to prevent Li Dan from either collapsing under the weight of complete truth or using partial knowledge to challenge her authority. The implementation of this strategy begins with small acknowledgments of discrepancies Li Dan has already noticed, accompanied by explanations that frame these inconsistencies as necessary protections rather than deliberate deceptions. Wu admits that his brother's situation is more complex than he has been told, but explains this complexity in terms of Zhongzong's own poor judgment and the need to protect him from political enemies who might exploit his weaknesses. She acknowledges that military threats are more serious than his tutors have suggested, but frames this acknowledgement as evidence of his growing maturity and readiness to understand adult responsibilities. These partial revelations have the intended effect of reducing Li Dan's psychological stress, while maintaining his fundamental dependence on Wu's guidance and protection. He experiences relief at having his observations validated rather than dismissed, and gratitude toward his mother for trusting him with more complete information. Most importantly, he interprets these revelations as evidence of his advancing toward full participation in imperial governance rather than recognition of his developing independence from psychological control. Wu carefully monitors Li Dan's responses to each revelation, adjusting the pace and content of subsequent disclosures based on his emotional and behavioral reactions. When he handles new information well, she provides additional details that deepen his understanding while reinforcing his dependence on her protection and wisdom. When he shows signs of being overwhelmed or developing potentially problematic independence, she temporarily returns to more restrictive information management while providing additional emotional support and reassurance about his security within the existing system. This delicate balance between revelation and control becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as Li Dan approaches his 10th birthday, and the political pressures surrounding Wu's succession plans continue to intensify. The military campaigns against northern barbarians and Korean kingdoms have succeeded in demonstrating Wu's continued effectiveness as a ruler, but they have also depleted imperial resources and created new obligations that will require sustained attention from whoever ultimately holds power. The temporary stability these victories provide cannot indefinitely postpone the fundamental questions about succession that threaten the entire foundation of Wu's revolutionary reign. By winter's end, the 10-year-old prince has become something unprecedented in Chinese imperial history. Neither fully controlled puppet nor independent heir, Li Dan exists in a liminal space that serves Wu's immediate needs, while creating long-term complications that even her brilliant political mind cannot fully anticipate. He possesses enough knowledge to understand the basic mechanics of his situation, without having the emotional or intellectual framework to challenge it effectively. This partial awareness makes him more useful as a ceremonial figure while ensuring his continued psychological dependence on the very system that constrains him. The spring of 694 AD brings a crisis that tests every aspect of Wu's carefully constructed succession strategy. A group of exiled Tang princes, operating from bases in Tibet and supported by foreign gold, launches a coordinated propaganda campaign designed to expose what they call the unnatural domination of a usurper empress over the rightful heir. Their agents distribute pamphlets throughout the empire describing Li Dan as a prisoner in his own palace, a tragic figure whose imperial birthright has been stolen by his own mother's insatiable ambition for power. These pamphlets, written in the flowing prose that characterizes Chinese political literature, paint devastating portraits of palace life that are accurate enough to be credible, while being inflammatory enough to inspire outrage. They describe midnight executions of officials who showed excessive interest in the young prince's welfare, the systematic isolation of Li Dan from anyone who might develop genuine affection for him, and the elaborate surveillance networks that monitor his every word and gesture for signs of developing independence. More dangerously, the propaganda campaign includes detailed accounts of Li Dan's psychological conditioning that could only have come from sources with intimate knowledge of palace operations. Someone within Wu's inner circle has been feeding information to her enemies, providing them with the specific details needed to construct a compelling narrative about imperial child abuse disguised as maternal protection. The accuracy of these leaked details forces Wu to confront the possibility that her most trusted advisors may be positioning themselves for the political changes that could follow her death. Wu's investigation into these security breaches reveals a web of competing loyalties that extends throughout the palace hierarchy. Officials who have served her faithfully for years have begun making discreet contact with exiled princes and foreign powers, not from disloyalty to her personally, but from recognition that her revolutionary reign cannot last forever, and that survival requires preparing for whatever comes next. Even Li Dan's tutors and personal servants have been approached by agents offering substantial rewards for information about his true condition and capabilities. The discovery of these betrayals forces Wu to implement security measures so comprehensive that they effectively transform the imperial palace into a prison for everyone within its walls. No one may leave without explicit permission. All correspondence is subject to inspection by specially trained censors. Conversations between palace residents are monitored by networks of informants who report suspicious discussions or unusual emotional attachments that might compromise security. These measures successfully prevent further leaks of sensitive information, but they also create an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that makes normal court functions increasingly difficult to maintain. Li Dan responds to this heightened surveillance with the adaptive strategies he has developed over years of psychological conditioning. He becomes even more compliant in his public behavior, while developing increasingly sophisticated methods for concealing his private thoughts and observations. Palace servants note that he has learned to sleep with his eyes partially open, maintaining awareness of his surroundings even during rest periods. He speaks in carefully modulated tones that convey appropriate emotions without revealing genuine feelings. Most unnervingly, he has begun to anticipate questions and concerns before they are voiced, suggesting an almost supernatural sensitivity to the moods and intentions of those around him. This hyper-vigilant adaptation serves Wu's immediate security needs by making Li Dan virtually impossible to manipulate or corrupt through conventional means. However, it also raises troubling questions about the long-term viability of her succession plans. An heir who has learned to trust no one and reveal nothing may be proof against enemy infiltration, but such psychological armor also prevents the formation of loyal relationships that effective rulers require. Wu begins to worry that her protection of Li Dan has been so thorough that she has created an heir incapable of inspiring the devotion necessary to maintain imperial authority. Her concerns deepen when she observes Li Dan's interactions with palace children during the few social occasions that protocol requires. Other young people, the sons and daughters of court officials who serve as his nominal playmates, instinctively recognize something unsettling in his behavior that they cannot articulate, but that makes them uncomfortable in his presence. He speaks to them with the same careful politeness he uses with adults, showing no spontaneous joy or curiosity about their activities or interests. When they attempt to include him in games or casual conversations, he participates with mechanical precision that demonstrates understanding of social requirements without any genuine engagement. These observations force Wu to confront a fundamental contradiction in her approach to managing Li Dan's development. Her efforts to protect him from political manipulation have been so successful that they have prevented him from developing the basic social skills and emotional connections that leadership requires. He has learned to perform the role of imperial heir with technical competence, but he lacks the charismatic presence and personal warmth that inspire loyalty and affection in subjects. This deficit might be manageable in a ceremonial monarch who rules through established institutions, but it could prove fatal in times of crisis when personal loyalty becomes the primary foundation of political authority. Wu's solution involves another carefully calculated risk that demonstrates her willingness to sacrifice long-term stability for immediate political necessity. She begins introducing Li Dan to selected young people whose backgrounds have been exhaustively investigated and whose families depend entirely on her continued favor for their prosperity and safety. These carefully vetted companions are instructed to behave naturally around the prince while being monitored constantly for signs of developing genuine friendship or emotional attachment that might compromise his conditioning. The results of these supervised social experiments reveal both the resilience and the limitations of Li Dan's psychological adaptation. He initially approaches his new companions with the same wary formality that characterizes all his relationships, testing their responses to various conversational topics and behavioral cues to determine what kind of performance they expect from him. However, the sustained presence of peers who treat him with casual friendliness rather than formal deference gradually elicits responses that suggest his capacity for normal social development has not been entirely destroyed by years of isolation and control. Li Dan begins showing genuine curiosity about his companion's experiences outside the palace, asking questions about family life and recreational activities that exist beyond the formal protocols of court existence. He demonstrates unexpected skill at games that require strategic thinking and cooperative planning, suggesting intellectual capabilities that his carefully structured education has developed despite its restrictive focus. Most encouragingly, he occasionally displays spontaneous humor and creativity that indicate the survival of personality traits that Wu's conditioning was never intended to eliminate. These positive developments provide Wu with hope that Li Dan might eventually develop into an effective ruler while remaining fundamentally loyal to her vision of imperial governance. However, they also create new vulnerabilities that her enemies are quick to exploit. The young companions selected for their political reliability proved to be less emotionally controllable than anticipated. Several develop genuine affection for Li Dan that makes them protective of his interests in ways that could conflict with Wu's strategic needs. Others begin questioning the necessity of the strict surveillance and behavioral restrictions that govern his daily life, wondering aloud why such measures are needed if the prince poses no threat to imperial stability. Wu responds to these complications by implementing what her advisors privately call the rotation protocol, a system that limits the duration of Li Dan's relationships with any individual companion to prevent the formation of bonds that might compromise his conditioning or create alternative sources of loyalty. Young people who show excessive interest in his welfare or who begin asking inconvenient questions about his treatment are gradually transferred to other roles within the palace hierarchy or returned to their families with generous rewards for their service and subtle warnings about the consequences of discussing their experiences. This systematic disruption of Li Dan's developing friendships proves emotionally devastating in ways that Wu does not initially anticipate. The 10-year-old prince, having finally begun to experience normal social connections, must repeatedly watch as people he has learned to care about are removed from his life without explanation. He cannot protest these separations without revealing the emotional attachments that his conditioning has taught him to conceal. Yet he cannot prevent himself from forming new attachments to replacement companions who will inevitably suffer the same fate. The psychological impact of these repeated losses manifests in behavioral changes that alarm even Wu's most loyal supporters. Li Dan develops a pattern of emotional withdrawal that begins as soon as he starts to feel genuine affection for new companions, protecting himself from future pain by refusing to invest emotionally in relationships he has learned are temporary. This defensive strategy preserves his psychological stability in the short term, but it also reinforces the very isolation and emotional detachment that Wu hoped the supervised socialization would address. Palace physicians consulted about Li Dan's deteriorating emotional state provide diagnoses that use the medical terminology of their era to describe what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of complex trauma and attachment disorders. They speak of imbalanced humors and disrupted energy flows, prescribing herbal treatments and meditation practices that address the physical manifestations of his distress without confronting its underlying psychological causes. Their well-intentioned interventions provide temporary relief from symptoms while leaving the fundamental problems created by his upbringing completely unaddressed. Wu's growing awareness of the damage her protective measures have inflicted on Li Dan's psychological development coincides with increasing external pressures that demand immediate attention to succession planning. The successful military campaigns that demonstrated her continued effectiveness as a ruler have also revealed the empire's dependence on her personal leadership and decision-making abilities. Provincial governors who maintained careful neutrality during her early reign now openly express concerns about what will happen when age or illness prevents her from maintaining direct control over imperial administration. These concerns are not entirely unreasonable, given Wu's advancing age and the physical demands of governing an empire that stretches from Korea to Central Asia. At 61, she remains intellectually sharp and politically astute, but palace observers note subtle changes in her stamina and attention span that suggest the inevitable effects of aging. Her closest advisors begin privately discussing contingency plans for managing imperial governance during periods when Wu might be temporarily incapacitated by illness or exhaustion. Conversations that inevitably lead to questions about Li Dan's readiness to assume greater responsibilities. The prospect of increased political role for her psychologically damaged son forces Wu to confront the long-term consequences of her succession strategy with unprecedented honesty. Li Dan possesses the technical knowledge and behavioral training necessary to perform ceremonial functions, but he lacks the emotional resilience and interpersonal skills needed to navigate the complex relationships that effective governance requires. His conditioning has made him supremely controllable, but it has also made him fundamentally unsuitable for independent leadership in ways that could prove catastrophic if Wu dies unexpectedly or becomes incapacitated before alternative arrangements can be implemented. Her recognition of this problem leads to the development of what palace historians later describe as the emergency succession protocol, a comprehensive plan for managing imperial transitions that assumes Li Dan's psychological limitations while maximizing the stability his legitimacy can provide. Under this protocol, Li Dan would formally ascend to the throne upon Wu's death, or incapacitation, but actual governance would be conducted by a carefully selected council of regents whose authority derives from detailed instructions Wu has prepared for various contingencies. The implementation of this protocol requires extensive preparation of both the Regency Council and the broader imperial bureaucracy for a form of governance that has no clear precedent in Chinese political history. Traditional regencies were temporary arrangements designed to bridge the gap between an emperor's death and his heir's maturity. But Wu's plan envisions permanent institutional structures that would allow ceremonial and administrative functions to be performed by different people indefinitely. This separation of symbolic and practical authority represents a radical departure from Chinese political theory that could prove either brilliantly innovative or dangerously destabilizing depending on how it is managed in practice. Wu's efforts to prepare Li Dan for his role in this unprecedented system reveal the full extent of the psychological damage her protective measures have created. When she attempts to explain the concept of delegated authority and institutional governance, he responds with the mechanical compliance that has become his default response to any situation involving potential responsibility or decision-making. He agrees to whatever arrangements she proposes without demonstrating any understanding of their implications or any curiosity about how they might affect his future role as emperor. More troubling still, Li Dan shows no emotional response to discussions about Wu's eventual death and his succession to the throne. The prospect of losing his mother, the only stable relationship in his carefully controlled existence, produces no visible anxiety or grief. The anticipation of assuming the highest position in the empire generates no excitement or sense of honor. He processes these momentous changes in his circumstances with the same detached compliance he brings to decisions about daily meals or clothing selections, suggesting that his conditioning has numbed his capacity for emotional engagement with any aspect of his existence. This emotional flatness extends to Li Dan's interactions with the Regency Council members Wu has selected, to guide his eventual reign. When introduced to these experienced officials who will theoretically serve his interests and implement his policies, he treats them with the same formal politeness he shows to palace servants and visiting dignitaries. He makes no effort to develop personal relationships with people who will hold enormous influence over his future, showing no curiosity about their backgrounds, opinions, or approaches to governance. His indifference to these crucial relationships suggests that he has internalized his role as a passive symbol rather than an active participant in imperial leadership. Wu's observation of these troubling patterns forces her to consider modifications to the emergency succession protocol that would further reduce Li Dan's actual involvement in governance while maintaining his symbolic importance for political legitimacy. She begins developing what amounts to a constitutional monarchy system, centuries before such concepts emerge in European political theory, with Li Dan serving as a figurehead emperor whose primary functions involve ceremonial appearances and ritual observances, while elected officials handle all substantive decisions about policy and administration. And so, Li Dan's story becomes a mirror reflecting the impossible contradictions at the heart of absolute power. Wu Zetian succeeded in creating the perfect controlled heir, but in doing so, she destroyed the very qualities that make leadership possible. The boy who survived her golden cage would eventually rule as Emperor Rui Song, but only as the hollow shell she had crafted him to be. His reign lasted mere years before he abdicated, unable to bear the weight of authority he had never been allowed to truly understand. In the end, Wu's greatest victory became her ultimate failure. She had preserved her dynasty by sacrificing her son's humanity, ensuring that her revolutionary changes would die with the damaged child she left behind.